Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Foster from Northumbria University in England. I'm working with Dr. Robbie Dushinsky on a Wellcome Trust funded project looking at the practice implications of attachment theory. This is one of a series of videos in which we ask leading attachment experts to discuss key attachment concepts and research findings and the relevance to work with children and families. In this video, the focus will be on intergenerational transmission of attachment. With me, I'm delighted to say, is Professor Deborah Jacobvitz. Deborah is Professor in the Human Development and Family Sciences Department at the University of Texas at Austin. Deborah specialises in parent-child interactions and their transmission from one generation to the next, and is undertaking longitudinal research on this. Deborah is also an expert on the adult attachment interview, is on the editorial board of the journal Attachment and Human Development, and has published widely on attachment. So it's great to have her here with us. So Deborah, when people talk about the intergenerational transmission of attachment, what do they mean?
The meaning of the intergenerational transmission of attachment is usually thought about how a person's experiences with their own parents in childhood are carried forward to the quality of care they provide their own children. And when it comes to applying an attachment approach, this usually means that it is the meaning of the behaviors you experience that are carried forward to the next generation, rather than necessarily just the skills or the behaviors themselves. So for example, if you were maltreated in childhood, you may or may not actually maltreat your children, but you may carry forward that experience of not knowing how to manage your angry impulses, so that some people might actually physical maltreat, other people might just say, I better do nothing because I don't want to hurt my child, but inadvertently neglect them or are overly permissive. So what you've carried forward in this meaning is not knowing how to actually provide proper limit setting or help children to regulate their impulses. And some people think they've changed and they didn't repeat the abuse because they don't repeat the actual behaviors. But from an attachment theoretical point of view, what they have transmitted is the meanings of their experience.
What does attachment theory tell us about the processes through which intergenerational transmission of attachment happens?
The processes by which intergenerational transmission of attachment occurs is, to think about processes, it's important to think about the experiences that transpire between the time that you experience these relationship experiences with your parents and how you treat your child in the next generation. And some of these experiences, I would argue the most important experiences is the relationships we experience over our life course. Because the way that we treat our child and the ways that we react to people are formed from our most significant early relationship experiences ourselves. So the fundamental importance in what will be carried forward has to do with what relationships we've experienced over time. So for example, if a child gets bullied by a peer or has a teacher who they feel doesn't understand them, it just reinforces the concept that they're not worthy of care. But if they have a teacher who takes that special moment to try to understand them, really listens to them, cares about them, they may be able to develop a trusting relationship with somebody early on, and it might mitigate the negative effects of having been with a parent who is maltreating or emotionally abusive. So the kinds of processes that transpire have to do with the kind of relationship experiences a person endures across the life course.
What about the intergenerational transmission of abuse? Does that happen through the same or different processes?
The experiences of abuse and the experiences of attachment can be distinct. So you can have a very loving parent who, for the most part, is very sensitive and attuned to your needs. But when the parent gets mad and upset, they may go off for a moment or may abuse the child But that doesn't mean that all the other moments are actually quite sensitive. So you could have both a sensitive caregiver and be abused. And in this case, I really believe, however, the abuse will override the sensitivity, because it'll be too traumatic to have those moments of abuse to feel really secure and happy in yourself and in your own relationships. Nevertheless, the fact that you had that security and that that parent was able to be responsive and sensitive should be acknowledged, because that means that this child has, that child probably will be more likely to seek help and ask for help. And when they get to be older and they find that they have that propensity to maltreat or blow up or hurt their own child, they might think twice and want to stop themselves. They might go get help from a therapist. They had something good in childhood to build on. And so it's important to not assume just because someone's been maltreated that they didn't also have some sensitive care. And I think that's really important to understand the full ramifications of their experiences as a parent, experiences with their own parents during childhood.
What does the research tell us about how likely these cycles of attachment and cycles of abuse are?
From the data, about 30% of children who were physically abused will repeat the maltreatment. This means that 2/3 will not. So it's not fixed. Just because somebody's experienced maltreatment doesn't mean that they repeat it. Now, it is true that although they may not repeat the maltreatment per se, they may repeat the abuse in a different form. But still, probably at least 1/3 of the families will not repeat any form of maltreatment because they've had some kind of corrective or positive experiences throughout their lives with other caregivers, other relationship experiences. There's some, and maybe some kids actually have some type of resilience.
What do we know about how intergenerational cycles can be changed for the better?
I've been involved in 2 major studies to address the question about how intergenerational cycles of abuse or insecure attachment can be modified or changed. And in both cases, one is the Minnesota sample and one is the Austin longitudinal sample. And in the Minnesota sample, it was parents who were able to form relationships with alternative attachment figures are more likely to not repeat the cycle of abuse. And so if they had developed a trusting relationship either with a therapist or a grandparent or even the neighbor down the street, it changed their model of themselves. They learned how to trust other people and they're less likely to repeat the abuse. And in the Austin study, it's parents who were actually insecure on the adult attachment interview who had a representation of their parent as being negative, or they're still caught up in the negative experiences of childhood, or they dismiss them and say they're not important. Those people typically would form an insecure attachment with their babies. But in our studies we find that if, again, they had a supportive relationship with a family member growing up, a grandparent, or even somebody at church or a teacher, that they're actually more compassionate and forgiving of their parents and of themselves and able to form a secure attachment with their own babies.
Reflecting on our discussion, why is knowing about intergenerational cycles of attachment and abuse so important for social workers and other practitioners working with children and families to know about?
Well, it's important for practitioners to understand the intergenerational transmission of parenting because, for one thing, it's important to know it's not fixed. If you find out and you're working with somebody that they've been abused or maltreated, you can't simply just assume they're going to maltreat their own child. It's not a fixed deterministic experience. It's more important to actually look at what else happened in their childhood. What other experiences have they had? What are some of the ways that they've been more compassionate about themselves and their parents? And so one thing is that not to assume it's fixed. A second point is that it's important to build on the skills that they have. And just because somebody has been maltreated doesn't mean they can't be sensitive with their own child, especially since we mentioned that people could have had a very sensitive caregiver and been maltreated. So they have these positive experiences that they can build on. And so it's important to be looking for what's positive about their childhood, to build on that, than to only be thinking, oh, they're like damaged goods, that they can't actually provide very sensitive and quality care for their own children.